Okay. All right. So pretty easy today. I was gonna give you guys a worksheet, but I decided because it's spring break coming up not to do that. So what I'm gonna do is just go through the notes, and you'll have about 15 minutes to kick it old school, like don't be chains and shell top Adidas. All right. So I'm gonna try to knock out this part. Now we're gonna have one more section when we get back. So when we get back next Tuesday, I'll finish up the chapter. Wednesday we'll review, and then Thursday we'll test. So we'll test over this chapter on Thursday. Seniors, I'm gonna try to get in 2 more chapters, to try to knock her out. So, but we don't have finals, so if I get to it, I get to it. If not, it's not. So what I want to do is I want to talk. This is the first part of section 4, the last section of the chapter. It's a continuation of section 3. So, like I was telling you, during the late part of the High Middle Ages, there was 3 events that roughly occurred about the same time, simultaneously. We talked about the Black Death in the 1340s and the 1350s that took out about 25 million people in Europe. And then in the beginning of the 1300s into the 1400s, we had that crisis with the church, the Catholic Church, the Great Schism, where we had the papacy, with the assistance and the help of the King of France, Philip IV, moved itself to Avignon, France. All right, so we had about 70 years. We had the Pope was not in Rome, but it was in France. Then at one point, the papacy returns to Rome, but then it also starts back up in France. So we have at one point 2 popes, one in Avignon, France, one in Rome, and it's confusing on who's the rightful leader. Both excommunicate each other. They have interdicts in various lands, and the political lines are drawn. And then at the end, there's actually another pope added in there from Pisa. All right, and the pope at the end of that from Pisa, John the 23rd, was basically funded by the Medici, who we'll talk about when we talk about the Renaissance. That ends with the Council of Constance in the early 1400s there, all right, with the election of Martin V, and the papacy moves back to Rome. So while those 2 events are going on, there's a war that's basically engulfing much of Western Europe, right? And this war is referred to in history as the 100-Year War. But it doesn't occur at the continued. There's breaks in the action. They break it into actually 3 kind of separate wars, but collectively referred to as the 100-Year War. And keep in mind, back then, people didn't know they were fighting in the 100-Year War, much like people didn't know they were fighting in World War I because they didn't know there was going to be a World War II. All right. The 2 main combatants are England and France. All right. And most of it's fought in France. And this is essentially over who is the rightful heir to the French crown. Now, there's confusion that's kind of created that dates back to the Norman invasion in 1066. So when I was talking about William the Conqueror, he's the Duke of Normandy, which is that state that was in northern France. As the Duke of Normandy, he was a vassal to the King of France. Right? However, in 1066, he invades England and becomes the King of England. So that starts the pattern of the kings of England also being vassals to the kings of France. However, in many cases, they were stronger than the kings of France, right? And that sometimes changes, though, like with Philip Augustus and John I kind of retaking Normandy and stuff. There's that issue. And then also what we have is with a lot of these kind of royal families, they're somewhat incestuous, right? Because what we start to see is a lot of them kind of marrying off sons and daughters to basically solidify treaties. That was a prime example here. So last chapter, I talked about Edward I, right? Longshanks. He was the King of England who essentially was contemporary with Philip IV. He was the one who established the model parliament, and Philip kind of modeled that with the Estates General, right? Edward, his son becomes Edward II. Edward II marries one of Philip's daughters, right? Isabella, all right? There was a treaty between the 2 countries, all right? They have a son, all right? That's Edward III. Now, what ends up happening here is that Philip IV dies, all right, and his son Charles IV becomes king. When Charles dies, he doesn't have a male heir, all right, and much like in England, these are very kind of patriarchal societies. It's not till later, like in England, where they allowed women to kind of rule as monarchs, and actually some of them are the strongest monarchs, like Queen Elizabeth I, Queen Victoria, stuff like that. But in France, that wasn't the case. So what ends up happening is that the kingship is passed to one of Charles's cousins, John II. However, this guy, Edward III, basically says, hey, I'm closer in relation than John is. I should be the rightful heir because my mother was daughter to the king of France. So he basically invades France to claim his throne, or his French throne. They refer to this phase of the war as the Edwardian War. This starts it. Now you notice it starts about 10 years, about 11 years or so before the Black Death. The Black Death kind of is taking place during this war as well. So we got that kind of thrown in. The papacy up at this time is actually in France, right? In southern France here. So the first real major battle, right? It takes place about 11 years later. It's the Battle of Crécy, which is where we see the large armies kind of fighting against one another. This is a victory for the English, mainly because of the introduction of one kind of like new weapon, and that's the longbow. All right. The longbow is significant because the French are using crossbows. Crossbows can be somewhat, while they're effective, to load them, it can take a longer time. Sometimes you have to use your full body, basically kind of put them down, put your feet like there, and kind of pull it back up. All right. The longbow was like a machine gun in the state. It was lighter and allowed the English to basically kind of like fire weapons on it. And then also we see the introduction of the cannon. All right. Now, in reality, this cannon doesn't make a big difference on the battlefield, but it's a start. All right. And eventually, within 100 years, we start to see cannons get much larger and used in the more traditional manner that we know today. And that is added with the addition of gunpowder as well. All right. So the Crécy is significant for basically those two kind of introductions of kind of like a warfare technology, if you will. All right. And this is Edward. All right. Now, if you notice what he's wearing here is essentially the flag or the standard of kind of England at the time, which mixed the kind of three English lions, all right, and the fleur-de-lis, which was the flag of France. So even in the English flag, even before Edward, that was the symbol, kind of connecting them with France to a certain extent. All right. And then this is the kind of the Battle of Crécy. On the left side here are the French. You see this guy kind of loading up a kind of crossbow, and then this is what the English were using. This is what it looked like. Again, to us, we're like, big deal, not that bad. But it was a game changer because it was made things lighter, more efficient, and was quicker to load. All right. And then this is the first cannon that was used in battle. All right. Mainly used to shoot arrows. Not big deal. It doesn't make much of a difference. But again, you have to start with something. All right. So that's why Crécy is kind of significant, because in the introduction of the cannon as a weapon of warfare. All right. Also, another important figure was Edward's son within this. That's Edward, Prince of Wales. All right. Remember it was his great grandfather, Edward I, who established that with basically representing to the Welsh his infant son. All right. Now he's also referred to as Edward of Woodstock, I think, as well. He is also referred to as the Black Prince. All right. Now, I've read multiple histories that said that one history claimed that he never would have heard that term. That was actually first used in the 1500s in a history. But then there's other historians that claim that he probably would have heard that. And the origins of that depend on where you're getting from English or French sources. So the origin of the English sources basically said he's referred to Black Prince because his armor and shield were darker. All right. The other one coming from French chroniclers may even refer to because of the atrocities that were committed against the French under the English at that time. There was a number of atrocities by kind of like English kind of nobles and knights that kind of came through there. There was a number of like kind of complete towns that are completely wiped out. All right, and so this is often considered the high point of chivalry, but also the low point of chivalry as well. All right, so at one point he captures King John. All right, the king of France. All right, and basically his son, John's son, has to basically kind of pay a ransom to get him back. That ransom is paid at what's called the Peace of Breton, which is a treaty that ends the conflict of the kind of Edwardian War in 1360. All right, so the English are basically claiming most of northern France. Now, Edward is not put on the throne of France. All right, that he doesn't go quite that far. All right. This is an image of the Black Prince as a member of the Order of the Garter, which was probably the most famous chivalric kind of like order that was established by his father. Unfortunately for him, he dies before his father. He dies of dysentery in a particularly kind of horrible way. All right. And then when Edward dies, the Black Prince's son, Richard, becomes king. Now, Richard's only 10 when he becomes king. So the first like 10 years almost of his life are basically ruled by regents. All right. So the French are going to take advantage of that, and they're going to resume hostilities about 4 years later. All right. This is referred to the Caroline War from the French perspective. Caroline was kind of another term for Charles. This is named after Charles V, who succeeds his father, John II. All right. Charles is going to take advantage of the fact that Richard II, and much of like a lot of his history you actually get from Shakespeare, is a rather weak king. All right. And then another thing is that Charles is going to learn from his father's mistakes. So when we talk about feudalism, right, that whole concept of lord and vassal. So the idea was basically, I'm a lord, Faith is a vassal, I give her land, and then what is she supposed to kind of do in return for me when I ask for her help? What's she supposed to provide for me?
An army.
An army, okay. What ends up happening is there was a number of French vassal states that actually sided with the English. They switched sides. All right. So Charles decides to kind of go over their heads and go directly to establishing an army. Now, granted, a lot of them were men at arms, but with this new technology, that's basically kind of something you can do. So we start to see this whole kind of relationship with lord and vassal start to break down a little bit. And this is successful for Charles. He ends up capturing almost all the kind of possessions that they lost to the English, and then some. The only thing that the English control is very the northern part of Calais in that area here. All right. And Richard, like I said, is kind of has some problems. All right. A year after the hostilities and fighting here, he has to deal with the peasant revolt that I talked about. This period of war, also, we see the ramifications of kind of feudalism kind of start to emerge, right? And the Black Death, and the kind of breakdown of feudalism start to emerge here. All right. So there's Charles V, right? And then also the French are going to benefit from a new ally, all right? And that's in Spain. So at this time, Spain is not unified as we know it. All right, it's made up of a collection of various kind of states like Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and then in the southern part, it's still controlled by Muslims in Granada. All right, so Castile is one of the stronger states. So matter of fact, the Spanish that you guys learn in your Spanish classes is Castilian Spanish. All right, comes from here. So Castile actually aligned itself with England in the beginning, right, and then switched sides. All right. So with their help, the French were able to kind of create a naval blockade of the English Channel. All right. So this prevented the English from getting reinforcements and supplies and stuff like that into that. All right. So this and naval battles are like pretty simple. This is the famous Battle of La Rochelle. All right. It's essentially at this time is where you basically get your ship close enough where you can embark and fight hand to hand. All right. It's not until the development of the cannon as a large kind of weapon of war where you can and cannonballs and stuff like that where you can get distance from that. All right. So this is basically kind of a simple battle at the same type of battles that the Greeks would kind of have. All right. So the second phase of the 100 Years' War is a French victory. The third phase restarts back up in 1397. All right. So there's a little bit almost a 20-year period where we find no fighting going on. This phase is referred to as the Lancastrian War, and it lasts about 40 years. All right. So the first, and it's named after the fact that the King of England at the time, Henry V, is part of the royal family is part of what they call the Plantagenet, House of Plantagenet. Dates back to William the Conqueror. And so what we find here is that there's sub houses like cousins and stuff like that. The Lancasters were one of them, and so Henry V becomes king. Now Henry V in English history is one of the more stronger kings. All right, he actually leads into battle. The significant battle is the Battle of Agincourt. All right, and Shakespeare wrote the play Henry V, and there's a big scene in there where Henry gives this inspired speech. All right, and the focus on because the battle took place on St. Crispin's Day, so they often refer to it as St. Crispin's Day speech or whatever like that. And so he leads into the battle. This battle is called the Battle of Agincourt. This is significant because they nearly completely wiped out the entire French army. All right, particularly with the use of the longbow. All right, so after this, essentially the French are on retreat here. All right, and so there's Henry V, nice doily and mustache combo. All right, and this is a painting of Agincourt. On the right are the English, on the left are the French. Now the French did have longbows, but the English were much better at this. And so there's a legend that kind of emerged from this that before Agincourt, the French put a bounty on English and Welsh longbowmen. So if any longbowman was captured, they would cut their fingers off, these two fingers. Now, why would they cut these two fingers off? So they couldn't pull the bow. So as Agincourt goes on, it appears it's a complete massacre. The French retreat, what's left of the French army. So according to legend, as the French are retreating, the English and Welsh longbowmen basically throw their fingers up to basically taunt the French. So they're doing this, all right? In England, you do this, it's called giving the forks, all right? So you got basically telling somebody off like this. Now, over time, as this kind of like changes, the index finger is dropped and it becomes this, all right? Now, I don't know if it's true or not because there's some people that are debating this, Well, what I like about the story is that I can keep this, I can flip you guys off and still keep it in the context of pedagogy. All right. So not really sure if it's totally true. All right. There's some people that debate it, but it's a great story nonetheless. All right. But in the here and now, what ends up happening here is that the French are on retreat. All right. And also at the time, the king of France at this time is Charles VI. He is known as history as Charles the Mad. He's probably, for a lack of a better terminology, a little crazy. All right. And so with the help of the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, the English are going to take over Paris. All right. As a result, Charles VI signs a treaty, the Treaty of Troyes, under kind of duress, which ends hostilities is the idea. But also to add to that, he basically gives one of his daughters, Catherine of Valois, hand to marriage to Henry V. And the agreement is that their offspring will not only be the King of England, but also the King of France. So the goal that Henry III had basically kind of set out with starting this war looks like it's going to be completed by Henry V here. All right. And so that looks like that's going to appear in this here. All right. And so what ends up happening, though, is that there already is an heir to the kind of French crown. Right. It's Charles VI's son, Charles VII. Here's Philip the Good. That's the type of hat he's wearing a cappuccino, which is kind of a popular form of hat for like merchant class and stuff in the kind of late Middle Ages. This is the marriage of Henry and Catherine. Right? And then what I was telling you is that there already is an heir to the French crown. Now, the title given to the eldest son of the French king, the heir to the throne, much like the Prince of Wales is the term for the heir to the English crown, is Dauphin. All right. And so the Dauphin at the time of the Treaty of Troyes is Charles VII. All right. And so Charles is essentially kind of basically kind of garnering support in the southern part of France, middle and southern part of France. Right. So there's a number of people who are not going to recognize this union between Henry and Catherine. All right. So what ends up happening is that Charles tries to basically kind of inspire the French to kind of back him. The problem is he doesn't have much of an army. All right. So the English basically like, all right, we'll have to kind of basically teach you guys the lessons. And they invade those parts of France that are basically kind of like controlled or at least influenced by Charles VII. All right. For the most part, it looks like it's a foregone conclusion that the rest of France is basically going to be completely kind of like taken over by the English. All right. So this is Charles VII. All right. It's good looking too. And then this is the kind of the map of what it looks like in France right there. So the areas in red and dark are basically controlled by the English and their Burgundian allies, and then those areas kind of in southern France there are loyal to Charles VII. All right, but like I said, it looks like it's a foregone conclusion. However, history is filled with individuals who are unlikely figures that are going to change the course. There are figures that are kind of regular people for the most part, but they do exceptional things. All right, and a prime example of that occurs to the tail end of the Lancastrian War, and that's the emergence of a young girl from Domremy. We know her as Joan of Arc. All right. So Joan of Arc was this teenage peasant girl, all right, who claimed to hear voices from St. Catherine and St. Michael, as well as God, basically telling her to basically kind of throw the English out. All right. So we just take Joan of Arc for what she is, right? That's just the story. You have to keep in mind at the present time how crazy the story is. So she goes to the King of France, says, "Let me not only join the army, all right, join the military, but lead an army." All right. Charles VII's like, okay. All right. That's how desperate, you know what I'm saying? That's how crazy that was. That's the biggest gamble probably in world history that paid off. So she goes to Orleans, all right, which is a city that's being sieged by the English. If Orleans falls, then Reims falls probably. And then that's the end of it. What ends up happening is she basically, she kind of inspires the French. They basically kind of throw the English, they hold them off, and then she leads in a few more battles and defeats the English, right? This is a complete, it's a game changer, right? And then later she convinces Charles to go to Reims. They were safe enough to go to Reims, and we're going to be officially crowned King of France. That was significant because dating back to the Merovingians of the Frankish kingdom with Clovis I, that's where all French kings were officially recognized, all right? So this is an unlikely figure, a completely unlikely figure to kind of change the game. I was going to show you this video from, do you guys watch Drunk History? There's great Drunk History where Vanessa Hudgens plays Joan of Arc. It's really good, but if I showed it, I would be like the person talking about it was drinking whiskey, so I don't want to insurance that, and they probably would have snagged it. But it's a good one if you ever want to watch that. So this is Joan, and she's one of the patron saints of France, or maybe the patron saint of France. This is a kind of a famous painting, painted much later of her, basically kind of leading the siege, leading against the siege of Orleans. Right. However, in 1430, she is captured by the Burgundians, who turned her over to the English, who put her on trial for heresy. All right. Another thing, she was put on trial for dressing like a man. All right. I believe she escaped a couple times and was caught. All right. And then finally, basically, she was burned at the stake. Now, I read one historian who claims that Charles probably could have negotiated for her. All right. But her death was actually basically as a martyr, more of an inspiration. And so there's this sense where she kind of inspired French nationalism, meaning she inspired people to kind of look at themselves as being part of the French nation, not just part of their kind of like feudal state, if you will. Nationalism is a double-edged sword here. Nationalism is the feeling of loyalty to one's own land and people. That's on the positive side. Nationalism can turn on an ugly side when people basically put it us versus them to a certain extent and become what we call xenophobic to a certain degree. But in this sense of nationalism, she's going to inspire people to look at themselves as being kind of French. And eventually, this is what happens. All right. Henry V is dead by now. All right. The English are basically kind of being pushed out, and they basically are only relegated to the very northern part of France by the end. So really, if you had to say who won the 100 Years' War, it was France. All right. But on the bigger picture, what was the kind of effects of this, the ramifications, if you will? One is we start to see kingdoms develop more into nation states, and that was a trajectory that we started to see in the kind of the 12th century, the 1100s, so we talked about last chapter. When I say the end of medieval warfare, I mean more like the beginning of the end, particularly with kind of the new technology and the kind of like the idea that having a knighted cavalry was a very much of a distinct advantage starts to kind of the finish there. Also, that idea of lord and vassal relationship. Monarchs start to replace feudal kings. We look at places like France, we start to see the kings use more broader taxing powers to generate more revenue. Professional standing armies kind of replace that idea of the feudal kind of system. And then we also start to see a literati class, a professional class emerge as kind of officials, replacing nobility and clergy. And then the rise of the middle class and merchants, which we'll talk about when we talk about the Renaissance in more detail. So on Tuesday, I'll talk about France is on the ascension here, particularly the monarchy. England is going through a transition, and that transition leads to a civil war called the War of the Roses, which we'll talk about. And then I'll talk about Spain, the kind of Reconquista, the kind of unification of the Spanish state, the Habsburgs and the kind of Holy Roman Empire and how they tended to marry into a whole bunch of royal families, and then the rise of Moscow and the kind of Russian state. All right, so that's what we'll finish on Tuesday. All right, did you guys get this? So you guys got time to kick it, about 15 minutes. All right. Did you get that, Madison? Oh, she left. Never mind.